Hello and welcome back. This is the week 5 lecture. So today and this week we get moving on The Coquette. This is our next major text. It is a novel, but it's a relatively short novel. So in the past I've devoted 2 weeks to this book, but in more recent times I've decided really we can get through it in a week. That's not ideal, and if it does take you a little bit longer than just 1 week to finish the entire book, that's okay. But our primary goal here in week 5 is to read the entirety of The Coquette. And as is often the case, if you got the edition that I ordered, there's a very good critical scholarly introduction that I would like you to read at the very beginning before we get to the actual novel. Take a look at that intro by Kathy Davidson. It's just worth reading. I'm going to repeat a few things that Davidson says here today in lecture, but for the most part, those critical intros give you guys a lot of the historical context that I don't really have the time to provide you with, so they really are valuable. I hope you saw that with Cabeza de Vaca. I hope you guys took the time to read that critical intro. It is worthwhile. Again, I wouldn't ask you to read it if I didn't think it would help the overall experience and help you have a better grasp on the book itself. So start with the Davidson intro and then tackle the novel itself by Hannah Webster Foster. So this is an important book for a lot of different reasons. We're going to talk about it sort of from a historical standpoint a little bit today, kind of continuing where we left off last week as we were tracking the development of a uniquely national literature. Now that can mean a lot of different things. We can have a lot of interesting debates about what constitutes a national literature. But if we're just thinking about it in sort of the traditional, conventional way, as far as like a chronology, we are in the 1790s here, pretty much where we left off last week with Philip Freneau. So remember last week we did a very big survey where we started with Bradstreet. We talked a little bit about colonial literature. Then we moved up to the early national period, which really means we've just become an independent nation. So it's like the end of the 18th century into the very beginning of the 19th century. So we mentioned Freneau, we looked at a couple of his poems, and then I think we finished last week's lecture talking about Brackenridge and modern chivalry. Now, he started writing that book in the 1790s, but he did not finish until 1815. So some historians will argue that, and lit scholars will argue that modern chivalry kind of, is a marker or sort of like a mile marker for the early national period because he's writing it kind of throughout that early national era. And that's that's where we still are. So we're going back to the 1790s. We have just recently become an independent nation. And so, our national literature could be considered to be in its infancy, right? We are just starting to produce novels, works of literature that can really be considered American, just in terms of where they were produced, who they were written by. So we're going to talk a little bit about this historical period and sort of what's going on with literary developments, what's going on with literature during this time. Because what's kind of fun and interesting about American lit, because it hasn't been around that long, it is roughly sort of contemporaneous with the development of the novel. Now, the novel predates America by a bit, but if we're talking about the English language novel, it really hasn't been around that long. It's not that much older than America as a nation. We typically date the beginning of the English language novel as really the early 1700s, the early 18th century. So really just a handful of decades before the American Revolution, before we become an independent nation and we start producing novels of our own. But what's interesting is, when we do start producing novels of our own, at the end of the 1700s, the novel form is still new, and people are still learning about it. People are still adjusting to reading it and understanding it. So we come in sort of at the ground floor, or at least one of the low, near the ground floor. We come in very early in this larger historical process, this larger development of the novel as we know it today. Now, we can talk about some precursors, some ancestors of the novel that were influential and, still kind of matter. But the way we think of novels, the way we generally read novels, the way we understand novels is all relatively recent. So that's going to be one of our goals today in lecture, to just kind of give you a brief history of the English language novel. I don't want to spend too much time on that, and obviously I can't really do it justice in an abbreviated time frame. That could be an entire class. We're only going to do a quick overview, but I just want you guys to know a little bit about it, both because it's important, I think, for English majors to know a little bit about how the novel developed, because the novel is the ascendant, dominant form of fiction today, and it has been for quite some time. I mean, it's debatable, I guess, nowadays. We can look at a lot of other forms that have borrowed a lot from novels. We might think of, graphic novels or memoirs. Those are really popular forms too, but I would still argue within the realm of fiction, the novel probably is still the most popular type of fiction. And that's been the case for a long time. So it's interesting to think about that because, again, the novel really isn't that old. Certainly not as old as poetry or drama. So in a relatively short period of time, the novel has gone from being sort of disreputable, not everybody really understood it. We're going to see a little bit of that today as we learn about the Coquette. It went from these kind of humble origins to now really being ascendant, being the dominant fictional form. So because that is the case, I think we need to know a little bit more about the development of the English language novel. And again, that's a history that's very much tied up with our own history, our own national literature here in the U.S. So we'll touch on that a little bit, but obviously I want to get into the book. I won't do plot summary. I'll let you guys do most of the responding and interpreting, but I just want to give you a little more context, talk about sort of the larger significance of the book, and then we can also get into a few more specifics towards the end of lecture. But let me just start with some of this stuff about the novel. And again, I want to go back to last week because we were getting into a little bit of this towards the end of lecture when I was talking about Brackenridge and Modern Chivalry, which is an early national novel. Like we said, Brackenridge starts writing Modern Chivalry in the 1790s, so around the same time that the Coquette is written and published. But I also mentioned something else near the end of lecture last week, which was the execution sermon by Samson Occam. So Occam's an interesting figure because he's really one of the first Native Americans to be published in English in this country. So he's kind of a pioneer in that regard. But I also mentioned the genre that he was working in. And I just spent a few minutes talking about it. I want to return to it today as just one of many heterogeneous types of texts that were around and popular in the 1700s. So if we go back to sort of the beginning of what we think of, what we know as the English language novel, that's kind of where we start in sort of the early stages of the 18th century. And what a lot of historians and lit scholars have pointed out over the years is there were a lot of popular types of texts back then. In fact, it might have even been sort of a wider, more varied field than what we would see today. Obviously, poetry was around, drama was around. So again, those are very old forms of fiction, really dating back to antiquity. The very beginning, really, of civilization. So those have been around for thousands of years. But in the early 1700s, there were some other sort of popular types of prose fiction. So let's just remember the key distinction between a typical novel on one hand and a work of poetry on the other, right? Poetry is written in verse. So normally there's some type of meter, or there might be a rhyme scheme, or there's some type of stanzaic division. There's something about the way that poetry is written that usually distinguishes it from prose. We find prose in novels and short stories, and also pretty much everything else, right? So like newspaper articles are written in prose, academic articles are written in prose, the things that we write each other, our emails, the little narratives we tell each other usually are delivered in prose. Prose would be considered more sort of realistic, common, everyday speech. Whereas verse, what we find in poetry and like older plays by Shakespeare, tends to have some kind of structure or some kind of repeatable pattern. Not always. We can find free verse, which might not have a meter or a rhyme scheme, but it's still going to sound a little bit different than prose, right? Even if it's free verse, there's usually going to be like more alliteration or more internal rhyme that we might be able to notice line by line versus prose, which typically does not rhyme. There might be some alliteration, there'll be some imagery, there'll be some figurative language, but we find all of that more in verse, right? We find all of that stuff more commonly in verse. Prose tends to be easier to read, more straightforward, again, trying to approximate the way people actually talk, right? And we don't typically talk in meter or rhyme, so we're usually just a little bit more familiar with prose, but we notice that when we sit down to read a poem, it's different, right? Because we're looking at verse. So today, when I talk about prose fiction, I'm talking about a lot of different kinds of writing. Nowadays, if we talk about prose fiction, we're probably just referring to either a novel or a short story, or forms that are very similar to those, like a graphic novel, right? Because that's typically, those are the most popular, types of fiction, again, in the modern world, and they have been for, I would say, at least a century, probably a little bit longer. So don't just think novel, though. When you hear prose fiction, now we typically just think novel, short story, or maybe a comic. But again, what's different about the early 1700s is it was a more heterogeneous kind of world when we're looking at literary production. There were a lot more different types of texts, and we've already seen a few of them. So the execution sermon would have been an example of sort of this early type of prose fiction. They weren't novels, right? If you read the Occam sermon from last week, that's not a novel. It doesn't look like a novel. It doesn't read like a novel. It's not as long as a novel, obviously. These were typically shorter narratives. And like I was saying last week, they really put me in mind of the modern day true crime genre, because they were purportedly true, right? Again, another way that we could differentiate them from modern day novels, which are usually thought of as fictional, right? These execution sermons were supposed to be true, right? They were supposed to be true stories of real criminals who were about to get executed. And the whole frame, the whole setup for a lot of these would be, a minister or some type of clergyman would be there to sort of take their final confession and to, walk them through last rites or whatever, but they would record the confession that the condemned criminal was giving before their execution. But they would add on to it as well. So it wouldn't maybe just be the sermon and the confession. It would also be a little bit of a backstory, the criminal's life, other salacious details about the criminal. Again, those were popular even going back to like the 1600s. There's a long history of what we might call sort of proto-crime fiction. Before that term existed, before novels really existed, there were a lot of different kinds of crime writing, and many of them would appear as broadsheets or kind of like cheap pamphlets that you could buy from like a vendor on the street. Sometimes they would appear as ballads. They would be poems or songs that traveling troubadours might recite, or they might even be set to music, and they would be sort of popular music of the day, often centering around sort of famous bandits or criminals, highwaymen. If you know anything about that sort of tradition in England, there was a lot of literature written about that stuff. Robin Hood, figures like that, sort of romanticized criminals. So there were poems, there were songs, there were brief little narratives that would be short and easy to consume. And those narratives would be in prose. The execution sermons would be in prose, right? So that's one of the many types of prose fiction that existed at the beginning of the 18th century. So a lot of literary historians have sort of pointed to this period as a very fertile time, sort of chaotic in the English language writing world, but there was all these different kinds of writing. They call it sort of this tangled mass of different 18th century texts. So there was a lot of crime fiction. There was also what we might call today sort of chivalric romance. This is another genre that I mentioned, at least briefly, last week when I was talking about modern chivalry and the main character, and I was talking about how he's similar to the main character in Don Quixote, an earlier famous Spanish novel written in the early 1600s. So roughly 100 years before the English language novel really takes off, there's already sort of a comparable movement going on in other parts of Europe. I mean, it's argued that the Spanish, the French, some other European nations were probably writing novels before anybody in England or the English-speaking world was. So we're kind of a little bit behind. But about 100 years after Don Quixote, we start to get a lot of English language novels. So it's not that far off. But we were just talking about how modern chivalry is very much borrowing the plot largely from Don Quixote, and the main character in Don Quixote sits around and reads chivalric romances all the time because he doesn't really have a job or like anything else to do, so he just sits around and reads, and it's sort of meant to be funny, but in the book, all of those chivalric romances kind of rot his brain and sort of cause him to be delusional and to go out and sort of fancy himself a knight of old. So you might be sort of familiar with these stories. We don't really read them anymore, but they've kind of permeated our pop culture. So you probably know a little bit about, knights or like King Arthur and damsels in distress, and you might know a little bit about how those stories were typically told. So these would have been called romances back then. We don't really use that term in the same way anymore, which can be a little bit confusing. But in the early 1700s, romance with a capital R would have been considered a genre. But it wouldn't have necessarily been like a story of romance, like a guy and a couple getting together and falling in love. That would have been an aspect of the story, but they didn't mean romance the way we mean it when we say like a romantic comedy or a romantic story. For them, a romance was more like a fantastical fiction story. Basically, it was usually including some kind of supernatural or fantastical element. So remember, I used that term back at the beginning of the semester, fantastical, when we were talking about Don Quixote. When we were talking about Cabeza de Vaca. And we were saying that even though it was true, the story often seemed almost larger than life, almost kind of, stretching credulity, almost unbelievable because of all these things that are happening, sort of, almost, sort of defying our expectations for reality. So some scholars said, even though it's true, it reads like an adventure novel. It reads like a fantastical sort of tall tale, a legend that wouldn't have really happened, but it's sort of symbolic or representative maybe of things that really did happen. But, we have to sort of read it that way while also recognizing that it was largely true, or at least largely based on true events. So again, that's important to keep in mind because that was a whole type of literature that existed for a long time. It wasn't always strictly about knights and damsels, but these were prose fiction stories, tales that were usually, kind of brief, but again, they often included supernatural elements, maybe some kind of magic, the undead, not strictly realistic. They would usually center around some kind of heroic, often male protagonist. Again, he might be a knight, he might be a warrior of some kind. He would often go on a journey. He would often have to overcome various obstacles, perhaps fight dragons or demons in order to accomplish his goals. It would be very exciting, swashbuckling. There would usually be a love story, right? At somewhere along the line, the hero would, fall in love with a beautiful damsel. They would get together. He would probably rescue the damsel at some point. And then there might be a happy ending. So it was kind of formulaic. And they really date back to the Middle Ages. There's really a tradition going, throughout much of Western Europe that can really be traced back to, medieval times. But that was still a popular genre in the early 1700s. And again, not all of it would have been knights, but for the most part, if you said romance, people would understand that it was a fictional story, usually in prose, though sometimes they were in verse. A fictional story, often in prose, but it wasn't meant to be realistic. And this is important to remember because, again, people have to learn how to read new genres. So when literature changes or when there's a new type of literature that gets introduced, there's usually sort of a learning stage, a learning period for the audiences as they adjust. So in order to understand why the novel was kind of weird at first, at least what we think of as kind of the modern novel, you have to understand what people were reading at the dawn of the novel. So what were people used to? What were the popular genres in the early 1700s? So we're going through a bunch of them. A lot of these early forms of crime fiction, chivalric romances, and again, ballads, classic poetry. People still went, obviously went to plays, drama, but also don't forget that there was another rapidly developing new form of writing during this time period. Newspapers. This is really kind of the dawn of modern journalism. Sometime around like the end of the 1600s and the beginning of the 1700s, we start to see kind of modern versions of newspapers and news reporting. You can argue that there were some forms of it even earlier, but again, sort of what we would recognize as newspapers really don't come around until about this time. So the development of the novel is really tied pretty closely to the development of the newspaper. Again, they're not the same. Newspapers are nonfiction. They're supposed to be telling things that actually happen. Novels are fiction, but they sort of grow up together and they borrow a lot from each other in terms of form, convention, how they're packaging stories. So it's important to keep that relationship in mind as well. So if we move to the late 1700s, obviously that's the beginning of the first U.S. newspapers, the first newspapers that we had as an independent nation, not as a collection of colonies under the control of the British Crown. So news stories are going to really prove important when we're thinking about early novels. The relationship doesn't always stay so close. Eventually novels kind of diverge a little bit more. But again, in the early stages, the 1790s, when we're getting novels like The Coquette, it's really important to think about newspapers and how they're developing at the same time. And a lot of American citizens are reading both newspapers and novels, right? That's important to remember as well. So what the kind of the larger point I'm trying to make is that around this time, not too long before The Coquette comes out, we have some of the earliest English language novels coming out of England and the British Isles. So an important figure in this process is Daniel Defoe. You might recognize that name. He was an English writer, a bit of a journalist, also wrote novels. He's famous for writing Robinson Crusoe, which came out, I believe, in 1719. He also wrote Moll Flanders, which came out in 1722. So Defoe's an important figure in the history of the novel. These are arguably some of the first English language novels. But what's interesting about Defoe, and what you need to know a little bit in regard to him in these early novels that he wrote, is that he was presenting them explicitly, and they were marketed as true stories. And in both cases, with both Moll Flanders and Robinson Crusoe, they were at least based on some real events. And the title characters were both based on real people. Again, Defoe had some experience writing for newspapers, so he was presenting them as true stories. They weren't 100% true. He was changing a lot of details. He was fictionalizing a lot of these basic narratives that he did pull from true accounts. But this gets at the heart of what a lot of scholars have talked about as this kind of bumpy, sort of rocky beginnings of the English language realistic novel. Because it took people some time to understand how to read these, right? Because they understood what newspapers were. They understood what autobiographies were. Right? That was another genre that already existed, right? People read autobiographies, true stories of people's lives, right? So we knew how to read those. We knew how to read newspapers. We knew how to read those chivalric romances, or those kind of, larger than life, unrealistic, fantastical prose narratives that dated back to the Middle Ages. We knew how to read those. We knew how to read execution sermons and other types of early crime fiction. But all of those were kind of easy to, you knew what you were getting into, right? If it was crime fiction, part of the appeal was it was based on real criminals, real events. If you were reading an autobiography, you knew it was real. If you were reading a newspaper, again, it's supposed to be real. But then if you're reading a poem, or if you're reading one of those old chivalric romances, you know that's not supposed to be real. Right? You understand that the chivalric romance, that type of fictional narrative, is meant to be invented. It's made up. You're not expecting that to correspond to reality, right? But if you pick up a newspaper or an autobiography, you're going to expect that to be real. You're going to expect that to sort of check out and be verifiable and accurate. So you can imagine the confusion. Again, in the English language world, we don't really have a clear definition for a realistic work of prose fiction in the early 1700s. We don't quite know what that is. So when we get these early novels from Defoe and they're packaged as true stories, people take them that way. People interpret them as true. And then they would get kind of mad when they would find out that they weren't true, or they weren't entirely true. And if you think that just happened for a few years, think again. That was still happening at the end of the 18th century when we first start getting U.S. novels. Some of the first U.S. novels, including arguably the first, The Power of Sympathy, written by William Hill Brown, which just like chronologically is the first novel, I think, to be published after independence. It got into a lot of trouble legally because it was basically the repackaging of a true story. The author, Brown, who was a real hack and not very good, just took a newspaper story that everybody was familiar with, at least in New England, changed a few names, altered a few details, and said, here's my novel. But funny enough, people's real problem with it was that it wasn't quite accurate enough. Like, readers knew who he was referring to. They knew what the story really was. And they were mad that he changed a few details because he was trying to avoid like a libel lawsuit. So he was trying to fictionalize it lightly, like Defoe did. But again, people didn't quite know how to take that. People either wanted it to be real, like real real, or they would expect a more fanciful, fantastical story. So again, they knew how to distinguish between a fanciful story and a plausible story. This is some of the terminology that historians use. But if they saw a plausible story, they would have assumed it was nonfiction. They would have assumed it was real. And then if they saw a fanciful story, on the other hand, they would say, oh, that's a romance, or that's some kind of fable or fairy tale. Or again, maybe even a narrative poem written in verse. We can tell the difference. But if it was plausible, if it was realistic, or especially if it had characters that seemed like a clear stand-in for real people, then the expectation was, oh, this is like a newspaper article, or this is like an autobiography, or a criminal confession. This is supposed to be real. This is supposed to be true and accurate. And if I find out the author changed stuff or got stuff wrong, I'm going to be pissed off. So I think we can kind of appreciate that sentiment of like, if I don't get accuracy, I'm mad. But it's hard for modern readers to understand not being able to suspend your disbelief, right? So what I always tell people, and this unit, is we are much more sophisticated fiction readers today than we were hundreds of years ago, right? We today, this group, we have a lot of advantages over the typical group of readers in the 1790s because we know how to read fiction, right? We know how to suspend our sense of disbelief. We understand that in a fictional story, we're not supposed to take the things as true, but they seem like they could be true. Right? The characters might seem like they could be real people, but we know they're actually not real people. The events of the plot might seem pretty plausible, like they could happen in the real world, but we understand that they didn't happen. At least not exactly like this movie or book is portraying them. So we know how to suspend our disbelief and say, hey, I'm going to go along with this and kind of accept it as a fiction consumer, and I'm going to get into the story and I'm going to care about the characters and I'm going to become invested, but you don't think it's real. Right? You understand how plausible or realistic fiction works because it's been around for a while. But back then, when it was still new, people had trouble distinguishing it from nonfiction. And it took time for people to kind of understand, oh, okay, this is supposed to be presented as if it could happen. It's being presented as similar to real life, but it's not meant to be taken as real life. So this is a concept that scholars talk about called referentiality. And again, we don't have to worry a lot about this when we read. But back then, it was a bit of a process, and it is worth thinking about because it is sort of a building block. It's a foundational quality to any fiction reading experience, is the idea of referentiality, or do the characters in a novel, do they refer back to real people? Or do the events of the plot refer back to real events that actually happened in real life? Again, nowadays we know that oftentimes, usually with fiction, the answer is no. I mean, there can be exceptions. There is a lot of historical fiction that will be based, at least partially, on true events. But again, usually we know what we're getting into. We've read the back of the book. We know what kind of fiction it is. And again, if it's realistic, but not explicitly based on real events, then we know that there's no real referentiality at work. Right? Again, these characters seem realistic. They seem like people that could exist in the world, but we understand that they're not stand-ins for actual people, right? Instead, they can represent types of people, right? This is actually the power of non-referentiality. And a lot of lit historians claim that the novel wouldn't have taken off unless readers realized that non-referentiality was kind of cooler and had more possibilities, right? Because if you're not using a character to strictly refer back to one real person, you actually have more ability to be more sort of inclusive, if that makes sense, right? If it's non-referential, right, the character doesn't represent one real person. Instead, the character can represent a lot of people, right? There's a more sort of capacious opportunity for representation and relatability. So you might have characters that are types. They are types of people, or they have traits or qualities that, readers are going to recognize and be able to relate to. Or they'll be like, oh yeah, my friend is just like that. My friend acts the same way when he gets mad. Again, you understand this character's not supposed to be your friend, right? He's not representing your friend in a direct, sort of factual way. He's just a type of person, the character, and you recognize that type of person. Yeah, my friend's like that. My sister's like that, right? That's the power of moving away from strict referentiality. And that's kind of what the early novels had to figure out, because early on, and the Coquette's a great example, the characters in this book largely represent real people. And a lot of the readers consuming this novel would have known that. Because Eliza, our protagonist, is a stand-in for a real person. Elizabeth Whitman was the real person, and she was reported about quite a bit in local newspapers in Connecticut and in other parts of New England. Actually, I think Whitman might have been from Massachusetts. The book is set in Connecticut, but they're pretty close, right? So this is a great example. The way the Coquette was sort of formulated is a great example of how a lot of early novels worked. Again, those early novels by Defoe, The Power of Sympathy by William Hill Brown, one of the very first, if not the first, U.S. novel that we're aware of, and The Coquette as well. They were all based on true stories. We can sort of call them ripped from the headline narratives. And we still have those. Like if anybody watches Lifetime or those kinds of network dramas, my mom is a big fan. A lot of those kinds of movies will be based on true stories, right? So again, it's an impulse that hasn't totally left us. But just a little bit of a backstory. I'll let Kathy Davidson tell most of it because she's better at it. Just the short version is that Elizabeth Whitman was a real person, the daughter of a sort of influential, wealthy local family who was seduced by a rake, very similar to Major Sanford in the book. She ends up sort of getting disowned by her family, having a child out of wedlock. Bad things happen to her. I won't say anything more because you might not have gotten very far into the book. But as you read, you will quickly realize that Eliza is just a slightly fictionalized version of this real character, this real person who was written about in local newspapers. So not only did Foster read about the real person in the newspapers, but much of her audience did as well. So they knew what they were getting. They knew who Eliza was supposed to be. They knew what a lot of these characters, the real people that these characters represented. But I think Davidson talks about this. What makes this book kind of cool and a little bit different than the sort of standard early ripped from the headlines novel is that Foster had to fill in a lot of details, like the true identity of the rake who seduced Whitman was never discovered, right? They never found out who the man was. So Major Sanford is largely the creation of Foster. Like, there's really no real life analog for him. But he's obviously a type. Right? And if you read a lot of early novels, particularly early sentimental novels, we'll talk more about what that means in a moment, you're going to see this character type a lot. Okay, so the rake was a very recognizable, familiar character type that readers would have known from reading other novels, from reading other sentimental novels. So he wasn't technically a stand-in for a real person, but he represents a larger class that many people could identify, recognize, have very strong opinions about. But in the case of Eliza and some of the other characters, they are clear stand-ins for real people. But when the novelist had to fill in details. Not every character was well defined in the newspapers, so there was still a lot of fiction work to be done by Foster to kind of fill in the blanks, to write dialogue, to create a sort of coherent plot that could be compelling throughout. But the basic sort of, the main ingredients of the story and the main character and her sort of family background, or at least something similar to it, that was all taken from the newspapers, from the real reporting of the real people. So in that way, The Coquette's very typical of a lot of these early novels. But there's another really important early American novel from the 1790s that we're not reading, but it's a good example of how the novel started to move away from this strict referentiality. And again, more possibilities opened up as a result. So an important title to know, we're not going to read it, but I just want you to know what it is. The book Charlotte Temple. Okay? Charlotte Temple comes out a few years before The Coquette. It's another example of a sentimental novel. And this is an important genre for us to know about because they were very popular throughout the early national period and really beyond, throughout the 19th century, all the way really till the end of the 1800s. The sentimental novel was the most popular kind of novel in the U.S. So there's lots of different types of sentimental novels. Just to give you a definition, broadly speaking, a sentimental novel is simply a work that exploits the reader's capacity for tenderness, compassion, or sympathy to a somewhat disproportionate degree. Or at least that was the perception. You have to understand that there was a backlash to sentimental novels. They were very popular for a long time. But in the early 1900s, right around World War II, when you first started to have academic scholars standardize the American literary canon, a process we're going to talk about more in the weeks to come. But when that process begins in the 30s and the 40s, as you can imagine, the guys doing the work, they were all men. They were all white. So they largely excluded writers like Phyllis Wheatley, and they excluded sentimental novels, even though they were popular. By and large, those guys considered sentimental novels to be inferior to novels written by the people they liked. Melville, Hawthorne, Whitman, other figures of the American Renaissance that we're going to talk about in future weeks. So what happened for a long time, we just really didn't teach a lot of the popular sentimental novels of the 1800s and the end of the 1700s because they were thought of as lesser in quality. Kind of like guilty pleasures. Yes, they were popular, but they're not art. That was the perception for a long time. But that's changing. Now they're getting taught more. They're kind of getting rehabilitated. We're going to look at some examples of other sentimental novels later in the class, but we are reading a sentimental novel in The Coquette. So again, it's a broad category. Remember that Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe right before the Civil War, that's another example of a sentimental novel. So in terms of storyline, plot, characters, it's very different than The Coquette. But remember, a sentimental novel is a very broad term that can refer to any novel that really plays on our emotions, or again, sort of exploits a reader's capacity for tenderness, compassion, and sympathy. So we're often feeling sympathy for the characters, or the main character at least, because they are going through various trials and tribulations. Another thing to remember about sentimental novels is that they were largely, though not exclusively, written by women. So again, another reason why they were excluded initially from the sort of collection of the very best American novels, because those male scholars weren't as fond of the largely female-dominated genre. Now, not all sentimental novels were written by women, but a lot of them were, especially in the U.S. So Charlotte Temple is another example of a sentimental novel, and it belongs to the same subgenre of the sentimental novel that the coquette belongs to. So these are examples of the seduction tale. So the seduction tale was one type of sentimental novel. There were other kinds, right? But that was just one subgenre that was rather popular throughout the 17 and 1800s. So the name pretty much says it all. The seduction tale would usually be about a young woman sort of coming of age, like Eliza, maybe looking for a husband, and they would be seduced by a rake. And a rake is this sort of an old-fashioned term for a sort of handsome but dissolute man who's, kind of a ladies' man, right? To use one sort of old-fashioned phrase, another one like to just, somebody who's not looking for a long-term stable relationship, maybe somebody not looking to get married, just looking to have fun, but often they would lie to the young women, promise them a happy future, promise them a wedding, only to often impregnate them and then leave them. So that's basically the story of Charlotte Temple. The eponymous heroine gets seduced and then abandoned by a British soldier during the American Revolution. And then she's kind of left to her own devices. Bad things happen. And it was hugely popular. In fact, Charlotte Temple was the first bestseller in U.S. literary history. So an interesting little trivia factoid that you might want to remember. Our first bestseller was Charlotte Temple. I believe it comes out in 1792, the first printing, written by Susanna Rowson. Rowson's a really interesting figure. I wish we could do something more with her. There's kind of an ongoing debate about whether or not we should consider Charlotte Temple to be an American novel, because Rowson was actually born in England. And her father was a naval officer in the British Navy, and they were stationed in Massachusetts when the American Revolution broke out. So even though by all accounts he got along well with his neighbors and he was a well-liked guy, he had to leave Massachusetts once the war started, and Susanna at this point was still pretty young, like a teenager. So they go back to England. She spends the war years there, and then she eventually returns to the U.S. after the war, and she would spend much of her adult life living in the U.S. She married an American man. She was an interesting figure, Rowson. She was an actress. In addition to being a writer, she was also a schoolmaster. She ran a school for girls. Had her own acting troupe, was kind of an entrepreneur, interesting person, and she was our first best-selling author. And Charlotte Temple was so popular, it remained the best-selling American novel up until Uncle Tom's Cabin, right before the Civil War. So it's just important to keep that in mind. From the very beginning of our nation, all the way until the Civil War, right? That's a period of almost 100 years. The two most popular novels during that time, Charlotte Temple, a sentimental novel written by Susanna Rowson, and then Uncle Tom's Cabin, a different type of sentimental novel, not really a seduction tale, but still classified as a sentimental novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. So two sentimental novels written by two women were the dominant sort of forces in fiction sales through the first 80 some odd years, close to that, maybe more like 70 years of our national history. So again, kind of a shame that we buried the sentimental novel for so long and kind of stopped reading it. But now it's making a little bit of a comeback. We're realizing it was really important when talking about the origins, really, of a national literature. But also, the sentimental novel is important when just talking about the origins of the novel in general. Because if we go back to England in the early 1700s, some of those early novels were considered sentimental works of fiction. So Pamela, written by Samuel Richardson, that's a really seminal text, comes out, I believe, in the 1720s or 1730s. You also had some works of satire being produced by Henry Fielding and some other English writers of that time. But sentimental novels were one of the first popular type of novel. often centering around a young female protagonist coming of age, looking for a husband, navigating complex social, sexual politics, right? This was one of the first really popular types of novel, not only in England, but also here in the young US. So it's just kind of interesting to keep that in mind as we're learning more about the national history of literature here. Also, if you know Pamela or some of those other early sentimental novels, you know that many of them were written in epistolary form, just like The Coquette, right? So the whole narrative unfolds through a series of letters. That's all epistolary means. Some of the letters, many of them are written by our main character, Eliza. Other letters are written by other characters, and the whole narrative is presented in that way. This hasn't gone away. Like, we still have epistolary novels today. It's not as popular of a technique as it was back then, but it's not gone. Like, we can probably still recognize it, and it's still a pretty fun way, I think, to consume the story. So again, it's important to remember before you jump into The Coquette, there's already a whole set of conventions and character types that have been established and that readers would have recognized because they had read Charlotte Temple. They had read Pamela or Clarissa. That's another one of Richardson's early sentimental novels from a few decades prior. They knew the genre, right? Because, again, a lot of these sentimental novels would have been based on true stories, or they would have been plausible fiction that wasn't necessarily referential. So again, that was still a process, but people were getting more and more attuned to reading that kind of work, right? But again, so it's, there's still a bit of a process with understanding realistic fiction, but one of the types that was beginning to get understood was this sentimental style, seduction tales, other stories meant to elicit our sympathy, often for female protagonists going through life's struggles, right? Sometimes we might expect them to be stand-ins for real people, but other times, like with Charlotte Temple, we understood with that book, or at least most people did, that it wasn't strictly based on real people. So that's how Rowson was a little bit more modern. She was tapping into the possibilities of non-referentiality. But some people did think Charlotte was real. In fact, there's a story, there's kind of a legend about how they set up a grave for Charlotte. And there was really, it was like real, like the kind of fan culture that I think we still recognize. Like, there were a lot of young people who really identified with the character. Charlotte was thought to be real, or they're based on somebody real. They had a grave site for her where they would drop off like trinkets and gifts and sort of like memorials. But again, what people started to grasp is that Charlotte wasn't technically a real person, but she represented a whole class of person, vulnerable young girls. At least that's how the story was packaged. And that's another thing to remember with sentimental fiction. A lot of it was presented as having a moral, instructional value. And that makes us a little uncomfortable, I think, as modern readers. We don't demand our fiction have that anymore. We don't demand that our novels teach a lesson or provide moral instruction. But one thing to remember about the origins of the novel is that a lot of the early novelists thought that they needed to have a lesson. They needed to be able to sell some kind of moral instruction. That's very much what Rowson's doing in Charlotte Temple. In a lot of ways, they're trying to justify the act of writing a novel. Because in the early days, novels were thought of as kind of a lesser form of literature, right? They weren't on the same level as poems or plays that had been around for so much longer, right? And again, because there was this often blurry line separating the real stories we read in newspapers versus the fictional but realistic stories that we were reading in novels, that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. That made people feel that maybe novels were too salacious, they were too titillating, they were too much sort of based on bad behavior or sort of illicit actions, and they were kind of tapping into people's sort of more base impulses and instincts. So we kind of mentioned this with the Puritans last week. They didn't think writing fiction was a very worthy goal. They didn't think writing poetry that didn't valorize God was a very worthy goal. And not everybody was that strict, but you do have to remember, and you're going to get a sense of how, restrictive and conservative society really was in the late 1700s, in the 1790s, but you got to remember, a lot of people didn't think novels were a good thing for young people to consume. A lot of older, more established people said, we think novels are having a negative impact on young people. They were almost kind of talked about like social media or like video games get talked about today as being something that was popular, and again, sort of a guilty pleasure, but not as artistically worthy as some of these older forms of art. Now, of course, we don't think that way anymore, but in order to kind of protect themselves from these charges of being immoral or salacious, a lot of these early novelists would say, look, yeah, there's going to be some illicit actions, maybe some bad behavior in this book, but my ultimate goal is to provide a lesson. My ultimate goal is to help readers to understand something or to teach them what not to do, right? There was supposed to be some kind of moral instruction provided through the narrative. So that's very much how Rowson presents Charlotte Temple. She says, I want to tell this story so future young women can avoid the mistakes that my fictional character makes in the novel. And I think Foster was probably making some similar moves with The Coquette. But I think what makes the reason we read The Coquette and not Charlotte Temple, I think what makes The Coquette a more interesting novel, a more interesting work of fiction, is that Eliza is a very complex character. Right? Charlotte is just really portrayed as extremely naive, extremely impressionable, really like childlike. And she is a child. I mean, she's like 15 or 16 in the book, but she's presented as being almost younger than that, like immature for a 15 or 16-year-old. Eliza's different. Not only is she a little bit older when we first meet her. I don't know if we get an exact age, but I generally assume that she's like 18, 19, like sort of late teens, and she's a little bit more experienced. Also, as we learn early in the book, she's already been married once. She was married away to an old man, some work associate of her father, who's a clergyman in New England. She gets married off to this old dude who promptly dies, before they can really, have much of a relationship. So she's already been married, albeit briefly. And it's important to remember that. We don't spend much time on it in the narrative, but you will hear about it in some of those early letters. So remember, she doesn't want to marry this old guy who's, could be her grandfather. She does it out of duty because her parents expect her to. Right? So you guys don't need me to explain the importance of social expectations, social roles, and what kinds of social roles women were expected to play during this period in history. You'll get a good feel for that as you start reading the novel. But Eliza contains multitudes, right? She's not just a naive kid like Charlotte. She's a pretty complex person. She's kind of polished. She's well educated. She can sing. She can dance. She can play the piano. She's a very eligible bachelorette. And you got to remember that she's sort of making her social debut, her sort of society debut early in this book, because she hasn't really had a chance to do that. She finished her schooling. She got married at a very young age to this old guy. Now he's dead. So now she's kind of entering society, really for the first time, kind of separate from her parents, Obviously, her first husband's dead. So now she's making her entrance with really one goal in mind. She is trying to find a husband, right? She's a middle class woman, well educated, well bred, pretty, got a lot of things going for her, but you have to understand she really doesn't have a lot of avenues towards economic freedom or comfort outside of marriage. Right? She's really boxed in. She's really confined in many ways by her middle class existence because she was well born enough to be educated and to have the expectation of not working. She's not really intended to work, right? But she's not super wealthy. She doesn't belong to a super rich family where where the father could just leave her enough money to live on, and then it might not matter if she got married or not. For a lot of middle class women, they weren't going to inherit any money from their parents. Any money that might have been left behind would have gone to a male heir. And it is mentioned that she has a brother. So her brother's going to inherit the property and whatever money the parents have to leave. She's not going to get any of that, right? And she's also not been situated to enter the workforce. She has not been prepared to go and earn her own living. So she really has to find a good match. She has to find a husband that will be able to provide for her, a husband with a good job, a decent income, somebody that will be able to support a wife and children, because of course the expectation will be that they have kids. And really her future is staked on her ability to make a good match. Right? So a lot of energy is getting devoted to that. And again, this is often the story of a lot of sentimental novels. A young woman, she's done with school, right? They didn't typically go to college back then. So they would be finished with schooling around 16, 17, around the time that modern people finish high school, right? And it's really time to get married and start a family, right? They're often doing that at the end of their teens, the very beginning of their 20s. If you waited much longer than that, often that could be seen as a problem, right? Remember, people didn't live as long back then. So once Eliza gets well into her 20s and she's still unmarried, as we see in the book, there's a stigma attached to that. There's a stigma to being a little bit older and still being unmarried, still being childless, and she has to deal with that. So there's kind of a clock ticking, right? There's all these really intense social pressures and expectations for her to get married. And she has a couple of choices, but we could argue that they're not really great choices. There's Sanford on one side, who she seems to enjoy his company. They seem to have fun together, but obviously he's not serious about getting married. And he's a rake. He is disreputable. People know that he drinks and carouses and has a long history of being with a lot of women. So he's able to get away with that, of course, because social expectations for men were very different. So he's able to sort of do what he wants. He has a lot of freedom. And notice that he has freedom of movement. He has the freedom to just kind of insert himself into any social situation, and that plays a big factor in the plot. Eliza doesn't have the same degree of freedom. She typically needs to be escorted by the Richmonds, the family friends that she's staying with in Hartford. She doesn't, as no young woman really would have had back then, especially not a middle-class young woman, she doesn't really have the ability to just go where she wants, do what she wants, but Sanford does, right? Sanford can come and go as he pleases. So he's able to place himself in her way, right? She often turns around and there he is, right? So Sanford's around, he's fun, he's good looking, but he's a rake. And the other characters in the book know it, and the readers should know it, right? Again, they're going to recognize that character type from other sentimental novels. They've read Richardson, they've read Charlotte Temple, so they know this type. They know he's no good. But what's interesting is Eliza kind of knows it too, right? She's not dumb. She's not super naive, right? She makes some poor choices at times, perhaps, but she's not really fooled by Sanford. I want us to kind of appreciate that. He does sort of charm her at first, and maybe, she makes some errors in judgment based on that, but she eventually sees through him. She eventually comes to realize that he's a liar, he's not reliable, he's never going to marry her because he's a gentleman of leisure, he has a very high standard of living, and he's running out of money. So he needs to marry a wealthy woman, and Eliza is not that. She is middle class. She has no big dowry that he's going to get on the occasion of marrying her. So that's why he's not going to marry her, right? He's going to marry for money. And he's hoping to carry on an affair with Eliza, which would be beneficial for him, but potentially ruinous for her, right? It wouldn't really have a big impact on his reputation, but as we see in the book, it could have a huge impact on hers. So we'll see the double standards. We'll see the kind of bizarre social and sort of sexual politics that were at play at the end of the 18th century. You guys are probably familiar with some of the differences in society back then compared to society now, and you might also notice some things that haven't totally changed. But Eliza is pretty self-aware. She makes mistakes, but she's also kind of aware of her confined position, right? Because Sanford is obviously not the answer, but then there's Reverend Boyer, who is respectable, right? He checks a lot of the boxes as far as an eligible mate. He's a clergyman, just like Eliza's father, so he has a stable income. That's a kind of an appointment for life. Like, he's never going to lose his job. He'll always have some type of, post. He'll always be able to minister to somebody. So he's stable. He makes pretty good money. He's, going to provide the kind of middle-class existence that Eliza is supposed to want. Right? So we get the impression, from her friends, from her family, Boyer's the right choice, right? Just conventionally speaking, he's the right choice. He's safe. He makes enough money. He'll be a pretty good provider. That's the safe choice. Unfortunately, he's kind of dull, and he's kind of judgmental, and he doesn't seem like a whole lot of fun. So she's sort of trapped between the safe but boring option versus the exciting but very volatile and unreliable option represented by Sanford. So, not great choices. I want you guys to kind of figure out where things really go wrong for her, because I think we can sometimes oversimplify the plot. And we can sometimes assume that Eliza's done like the minute she meets Sanford. It's like, oh, well, there's the rake, so we know how it's going to end. And yeah, we probably do. But again, there's more art to this seduction tale than there was to The Power of Sympathy or Charlotte Temple or a bunch of these less skillful renditions. Because Foster really wants to get into the psychology of Eliza and really wants to explore why Eliza makes some of the choices that she makes and how social roles and sort of social expectations play a role and how all of those things are kind of pushing her in certain ways. And yes, we can perhaps assign some blame to Eliza, but I want you to really pay attention to some of the pivotal moments in the plot. Again, they might be kind of hard to understand from a modern perspective, but I really want you to analyze how things play out between her and Boyer. Because what kind of pisses Boyer off is that he proposes and she doesn't give him an answer right away. Right? She's making him wait because she's not in love with him. She doesn't really have strong feelings for him. And she's kind of maybe hoping that Sanford will turn things around, maybe hoping for another option. But she doesn't reject Boyer outright. And I want you to notice that there's a pivotal moment where it appears that she has decided to accept his proposal. She makes the decision that she probably should go with Boyer. She does make that decision. Now, you can argue it takes her too long. You can argue that she makes him wait too long. She's too indecisive. Maybe. But she does eventually arrive at the conclusion that, hey, Sanford's not the guy. I got to go with Boyer. And I want you to notice what happens in that scene. The day that she is planning to accept Boyer's proposal. Of course, Sanford shows up. Sanford ruins it. But I want you to notice what happens. And I want you to notice what Boyer gets so angry about. Again, it might be hard for modern people to fully grasp it because it's not an affair. It's not something that would be an absolute deal breaker. It's not an affair yet. It's not an affair yet, right? At the point where Boyer rejects Eliza, I want you to really analyze that scene, that moment in the text, and really kind of form your own conclusions. Again, we have to almost, for a moment, kind of imagine that we're operating within the social climate of the 1790s, when the rules were very different. And the rules governing the behavior of young people were very different. Remember, Eliza is like a college-age person at the beginning and for much of the early stages of the book. She is, I guess, again, probably 19, 20, right? So just think about what she's doing. Think about sort of the modern parallels, the modern sort of analogs. Think about what people get upset at her for, right? She gets a lot of criticism in the letters written by other characters. Lucy, her friend, is often very critical. People are telling her what she needs to do to secure a stable middle-class life for herself. Stop being so flirtatious. Stop going out at night. Stop hanging out with Sanford. Don't make Boyer wait. So let's think about what she's expected to do. Let's think about what she actually does. And we can see it through kind of two different prisms. We can see it through the perspective of 1790s society, how things worked back then, what women were and were not expected to do, right? And then we can adopt our more modern perspective and decide, okay, from our vantage point, what do we think Eliza did wrong? Do we think she did anything wrong? Do we think the blame falls more on Sanford? Does the blame fall on her friends? Does the blame fall on some of her family? Does the blame fall on the people who were supposed to be helping her? Does she always get a lot of help? And again, try to isolate some pivotal moments in the plot where things start going wrong for her. Because again, a lot of what goes wrong for her is connected to her status, her reputation, how people think about her, right? So let's notice when that starts going south, when that starts going wrong, and let's try to create some cause and effect relationships so we can really analyze what happens and what we think about what happens. Both from our modern perspective and maybe from the perspective of the early Republic and this early novel from our national history. Okay, so that's it. I would like to talk more about the book, but let's do it on the discussion board this week. Okay, so let's try to talk to each other. I might jump on there and we can discuss the novel a little bit more. So do your best. Try to read most of it this week. And if you're finishing up early next week, that's fine. But we are moving on to our next novel next week. So we're picking up the pace a little bit here. If you feel like you're falling behind, if you're concerned, just shoot me an email and we can always talk. Okay, see you next time.